It is my pleasure to announce this year's keynote speaker, my friend and colleague, Dr. Neal Anderson. Dr. Anderson serves as the Vice President of Student Life and Enrollment at Colorado Christian University. He is also the founder and lead consultant at CARTO Leadership, a boutique leadership development firm in Littleton, Colorado, specializing in leadership training, coaching, and consulting. With nearly 20 years of experience in Christian higher education, Neal seeks to integrate his love of leadership with student development theory to build effective and healthy teams. When not at work, after he does all of those things, he enjoys local coffee, camping, skiing, and weekend hikes in the Rockies with his wife and 3 boys. Please welcome Dr. Neal Anderson.
Thank you. Dr. Hunt, thank you for that warm introduction. We were suffering not too long ago as students, just like you are, in grad school, and we were just commiserating. How did we make it through? How did we make it through our program? And somehow you do, and so I know many of you are at the beginning of your academic journey. You're going to make it through, but it is a journey, and so tonight, I'm just grateful. You know, it really makes a speaker feel great when you have required attendance to things and they have to sign in. It's a really good morale boost. So thanks for being here, and I love students. I work in Christian higher ed. I have for a long time. I teach a class right now of just freshmen. It's my favorite class I get to teach each year because you're at just the beginning of this amazing journey and opportunity where I believe when you lean into it, you can really experience transformation. 10 years ago, a colleague of mine by the name of Min Choi handed me this booklet right here. And he said, "You should read this." And he put it in my face. And I was a little confused. I was intrigued. First of all, Min, he made recommendations often, but this kind of had a directive tone. You need to do this. And second, let me look at this. It wasn't a book. It's just this little cardboard, 30, 40-page booklet. And so I was intrigued, and I decided I was going to read it. And ever since reading Makoto Fujimura's Culture Care, this little booklet in 2015, I've been entranced with this concept called generativity. That's what we're going to talk about tonight. Fujimura recalls a particular hard point in life, living in New York City with his young wife barely making ends meet. Discouraged and tired, Fujimura walks into the tiny apartment and sees a bouquet of flowers sitting on the table that his wife had just bought. Without certainty that they could pay for food that week, Fujimura quietly and resentfully lashed out at his wife and said, "How could you think of buying flowers when we can't even eat?" Fujimura's wife calmly responded, "We need to feed our souls too." What does she mean by this? What good can come from flowers that would last a few days and then eventually wilt, ending up in the trash, especially when there's a lack of resources? Fujimura explains in his little intro here, and it's an intro to a larger book on culture, that the act of buying flowers is like the act of creating a painting, making a space beautiful, maybe creating a song. It's generative. It begets joy because it makes the world bigger than just the moment you're in. Art has a powerful way of doing this. It reminds us of deeper truths and even helps us explore emotion and the human condition in profound ways, namely because there's a generative quality to art. Why do people walk through art galleries? I don't have that eye for art, but I know when people go through art galleries, they can experience something more than just the painting itself. As a pragmatist, I found the concept of generativity appealing and confounding. I began asking questions like, how does this work in other spheres of life? Is generativity just an art thing? Is that what it is, or is there more to it? What would generativity look like in leadership? Is there any research on generativity in leadership? And I actually, looking through the booklet this week, I flipped to the back and I had drawn some pictures and wrote myself some notes. And these are the notes I wrote 10 years ago when I first came across this booklet. I wrote, how does generativity apply to leadership and people care? And could organizational sustainability be rooted in generative leadership? Just kind of curious thoughts. These questions launched me into countless articles and studies on this topic, and as a result, this is now my favorite topic. I love speaking about it because generative leadership, I believe, is not only an important subject to explore, but it's essential for a thriving workplace. So here's what I'm going to do. Tonight, we're going to explore and articulate the following 3 things. If you're a note taker, this will be helpful for you. What is generative leadership? I want to unpack it. I want that phrase to be something that you could repeat back to your roommate or friend or teammate by the end of this night. Number 2, the generative leadership provides a method for addressing culture problems, culture challenges, and that this approach, number 3, can lead to a lasting impact. All of you, most of you in the room, you're young. You're thinking about like the homework you still have to do tonight, right? You're thinking about the things that are just. But this is. Let's step out of that for a minute. Let's have a vision for a second of where you're headed in your career, your profession, your future as a future leader, and these things will be core to how you lead. Now, the thing is, I don't think it's just for the future. I think there's some real practical application today. So don't let the terminology and the lingo and the academic phrasing hinder you from kind of thinking about how does this apply now. One of my favorite things about leadership is it applies to all spheres of life. Normally when I speak somewhere, I'll put a picture of my kids and wife up on the screen. I'll talk about each of my boys. I'll talk about what they're into. And there's a reason for that, because if I can talk about leadership, but it's not experienced in the home, what good is it? What good is it if it doesn't apply to my context? All of you right now, you have a context. So students in the room, consider the areas right now, I want you to think about this, as formal and informal leadership. Where are those places? What is the equivalent of your organizational setting? Is it a club? Is it a team? Is it the floor you live on? What are the cultural challenges in that environment? For others in the room, a stay-at-home mom or dad or a person from our community, perhaps your organization is your family or the neighborhood community that you're a part of. You also have cultural challenges that require leadership to address. Faculty, staff in the room, particularly those who may not have a direct report, how does this apply to me? I still think you have a sphere of influence, an organizational context. It could be a classroom. It could be a student group or organization you help oversee. You have influence in leadership, and you have an organizational context. Now, again, don't let those words hinder you, but I want you to think about right now, how does that apply? Whatever context you're in, I believe generative leadership will apply. So with one ear tonight, I want you to listen as best as possible. And I also want, almost if I could draw like a cord from your head to your context, you're thinking about the context that you're going to go back to. What is required of me as a leader? What is required in that context? What are the cultural challenges in that place? And hopefully, I believe some of this will be helpful, whether now or in the future. With the advent of AI technology, we're more familiar with this term generative in reference to artificial intelligence. And this is the question I get all the time. Neal, what do you mean by generative leadership? Well, after generative AI, I actually have something I can help people understand. Adam Ziwi says this of MIT News: generative AI can be thought of as machine learning, a model that is trained to create new data rather than making predictions about a specific data set. A generative AI system is one that learns to generate more objects that look like the data it was trained on. We sort of intuitively know this because you guys, you don't need to raise your hand if you're using ChatGPT in class and all the things you shouldn't be using AI for, but it is an amazing tool, right? It generates things that didn't exist before. Similarly, generative leadership is the concept that actions and behaviors of a leader can perpetuate more leadership. In AI terms, it's leadership data that looks like what it was trained on. In short, it's leadership that begets leadership. It's this going out, this growing of leadership because of your behavior as a leader. Generative leadership offers a way of viewing relationships, the organizational process, management, lots of other jargon, but it's anchored in something that I find really interesting: human development. Any psychology majors in the room, counseling majors? Human development theory. If you haven't had these classes yet, you will, and you're going to hear about a guy named Erickson and his work on human development, personal development. Generativity is the phrase he uses about the stage in life where you realize it might be more about what you give than just what you get. Right now we're all, and I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but your experience, your view of the world is largely focused on what you need and what you need to get, your college experience. I hear this all the time with students, my college experience. I'm looking for this in my experience. At some point in life, that tends to hopefully expand. Otherwise, you hit a stage called stagnation, where you just live for yourself forever and are miserable, is the end result. But generativity kind of happens when people begin to have children, and they're in late 30s, early 40s, they realize, maybe I want to give something to this world. That's the concept behind this, and that's where the leadership theory comes from. As one author noted, it's the capacity to foster and guide the next generation. In his most recent book, David Brooks, who I'm so excited, if you don't know who David Brooks is, and he's coming next year, this is astounding. I'm a little promo for next year, not in my notes. David Brooks is a phenomenal thought leader, and I've read one of the only authors where I've read every book he's written, and he is incredibly intelligent. So it's funny that, not funny, it's amazing that he's going to be here next year. You have the privilege of having him on your campus. Not an easy person to come speak. He writes this in his book, How to Know a Person, about generativity. And again, we're just trying to shape this concept so we have something to go off here. The generative person often assumes the role of guardian. A person with this consciousness is often leading or serving some institution, whether it's a company, a community organization, a school, a family. A guardian has an in-depth respect for the institution she has inherited. She sees herself as someone who has been entrusted with something, has taken delivery of something precious, and thus has a responsibility to steward it, to pass it along in better shape than she found it. A person with this mindset is defined not by what she has taken out of the institution, but by what she has poured into it. As students, this is an interesting challenge early in your time. What would it look like if you thought about your educational journey as something you could contribute to the University of Jamestown, and not just something you're getting? That's a generative mindset. It's kind of like grad school leadership in my mind. It's the next level. My first job in grad school, I was a GA, and I got the job description. I was pretty excited about what I was doing, and I heard I was going to have an evaluation, a performance evaluation with my supervisor. So she brings me in her office, and she sits me down, and I'm pretty pumped because I've done the job like really well all year, and I'm pretty proud of myself. I know she's going to just give me a glowing review. And the first question she asked me is, so Neal, how have you moved the job forward? And I'm like, that's a trick question, because I've killed it. I've done awesome at the job. How have I moved it forward? That's not fair. That's not part of you're supposed to tell me I did the job and I've done awesome, and like, here's a bonus or here's a raise, or we're going to give you more leadership. I couldn't even conceptualize I could not answer her question. How have you moved the job forward? I did not have a concept of that there could be something more than just doing the job. Honestly, I was too immature in my leadership. I was too young to think that there's something I could contribute beyond just hitting all the check boxes. Okay. Where servant leadership emphasizes sacrifice, I'm sure you've heard of servant leadership, but if you haven't, you will hear a lot about it, I'm sure. Ethical leadership emphasizes morals and virtue. Transformational leadership is going to hit at motivation. Generative leadership emphasizes intentional development and multiplication. All right, I know that we don't have a lot of research enthusiasts in the room, so I literally wrote here in my notes, if you need a 2-minute nap, now is your time. I wrote it, so I'm going to say it. It's going to be like 1 minute, and then your neighbor is going to give you a nice elbow when I bring us right back, okay? Here's what the literature says about generative leadership. I know some of you are like, yeah, I could use a nap right now. So I'm gonna take them up on that. I just gave you, ironically, permission for 2 minutes to do that. Number 1, generative leadership, it's an orientation towards relationships. Number 2, it's an orientation towards organizational structure. Number 3, orientation towards growth. And then number 4, an orientation towards uncertainty. So if you want to go study and research and read all the books and articles, you're going to find it's those 4 things. That's what it means academically to be a generative leader. I'm trying to rephrase these into 4 concepts that you could actually think, okay, I can do that, I can understand that a little bit better. Aren't you glad I did that? We don't have to just rely on just the journal articles. Number one, generative leadership, when they say it's a management process or a theory, what they're really saying is it's intentional relationships. It's about building intentional relationships. A generative leader views each key relationship in their orbit as one you have to be intentional with. There's no wasted relationships. People are not units of productivity, but units of personality. People must be engaged holistically, and in doing so, there's an increase in their leadership. So this section down here, it was helpful. I realized listening to them before I started, I didn't update my fantasy football team, and I'm already losing points because I have people on IR. And so I was getting to know this section for a second here. And if this was my team, and I was in charge of this group here, and I was operating from a generative mindset, I would need to build relationships with each person here. I would need to know them, their story, their name, and where they're from. We got Jamestown, we have, Utah, right? Running back, offensive line, Moorhead. And so I try, that's what I would need to do at an organizational level. I need to get to know the people I'm working with. That's a generative quality. Viewing people as products, units of productivity means, well, great, we've got people to do X, Y, and Z for me. That's not generative. Number two, generative leadership is when they talk about organizational structure, it's really talking about innovation. I love talking about innovation because it has to do with creativity. It's this idea that we can create systems and places where something of value can be created. Anyone in the last week, by show of hands, you've created something that did not exist before last week. Anything. Okay? Sort of. You're thinking about it now? I mean, think about that. It didn't exist. You did something. You wrote it. You played the song. You came up with the play. You built something. That's an act, that creation act, that's an act of innovation. You're doing something new. Generative leadership is grounded in this idea that you want to create value. But here's what's more. You're also creating structures and methods for that. So Dr. Hunt took me around campus today, and I was in some of your spaces and classrooms and labs, the engineering facility, kinesiology rooms. And you know what I saw was not just students in classrooms. I saw spaces where the thing that we say we're doing here, educating students, the space is facilitating that. So in a leadership perspective, a generative leader is creating space for innovation to take place. Space and systems to make sure those things that we aspire to are happening. Number three, it's developmental. And this is one of the underlying concepts of generativity. It's always looking to develop and to grow someone. Again, this is formed by Erickson's framework. And ever since we learned from James Burns about transformational leadership, we understood the importance of developing leaders. One person says, the generative leader, the profile looks like a builder. It's a builder profile. They have this idea of creating and developing. For this type of leadership, what is most crucial is transforming followers into future leaders, generating leadership in others, and sharing and extending power. Here's something that I find really interesting. You could be just the most phenomenal leader in the world. People respect you. You've accomplished all kinds of things. But if you don't have the ability to develop people, when you walk off the stage from your job or whatever it is you're called to, as a coach or as a professor, and you walk off, but you haven't developed anyone around you, everything you did leaves with you. Happens in a lot of places. And so there's this element of leadership that's how do I make sure I'm developing the people and resources around me so that when I leave, things don't fall apart, that I've actually left a lasting impact. And then fourth, and get ready, we're going to nudge our neighbors back here in a second. Fourth, this reoccurring theme and this orientation towards uncertainty. What's an orientation towards uncertainty? Well, it's better to phrase this as an opportunity. You see uncertainty as positive, an opportunity to adapt. It's not an organizational threat. We don't know what's coming. Oh no, you don't freak out. You actually see it as an opportunity to adapt, to do something new. A generative leader tunes the system and the people to problem solve. Aspire to new possibilities in the future by priming the culture to see uncertainty as positive. Becomes a natural adaptation, then becomes a natural byproduct when this is your view. This is a little crazy, but a couple years ago, I got a call from my dad, and he's like, hey, I was in a train accident. I'm like, what do you mean? He sends me a picture. The train is on its side, and he had climbed out the window on top. What? Where? I start getting all the text information, pull up the news. He's on an Amtrak train that a truck tried to run the cross, hit the truck, the whole train flipped. He hops out the top, he's okay. He was on the side of the train that was, actually went down. It's kind of scary to think about it. There's people that fell across the whole train car, lots of people hurt, lots of injuries. So he's recalling this situation to me about 3 years ago. I'm like, well, what was it like after you got out of the train? And he says, pure chaos. People didn't know what to do. It was kind of in the middle of the country. It wasn't even EMTs there for like an hour. They had to bring helicopters in to help care for people. It was chaos. And the reason why I share this story is because there's this lack of clear leadership in that moment, lack of communication. And what I thought would be really interesting is I thought Amtrak, and I can't remember what the actual train company was. I think it was Amtrak. Everyone started pointing fingers about who had messed up. And the chaos and lack of clarity, instead of seeing it as an opportunity to demonstrate why we can respond to emergencies, why we can have great customer service and make sure people have places to stay, this whole uncertainty of what's going to happen actually literally derailed all response for like 2 weeks. Now, I'm not saying a train accident is a good thing, but if you're a generative leader and some type of uncertainty is in your future, some type of chaos is in your future, you don't retract. You think of it as an opportunity to do something different, to adapt to that situation and figure out a way to make it positive. It's an interesting quality that some of us in this room, you naturally have an optimism about hard things. And that might mean you have some generative leadership quality. Okay, any nappers near you, now's your time. Just give them a good, strong, gentle, but strong elbow to come right back here. Okay, so here's, I like talking about this stuff, but if it doesn't work, what's the point, right? So if you're like me, the value of generative leadership as a concept, it sounds appealing, but how do we practically apply this? Student, how do you apply this? How does this matter to your life today? And I think that's the right question to ask about any leadership thing that you study. If it doesn't bring about practical benefit, it might be interesting to study, but it's not worth promoting. So as a practitioner, I want to know, as many of you do, does the leadership concept I'm studying in class or I see displayed on the field or whatever it is I'm observing, does it work in real life? And it should work in multiple places in real life. I like to say, does it work in the wild? My backyard is the Rocky Mountains. I go out with my kids camping and we get to hike and be totally alone in the mountains. It's awesome. And I want to know that the things I've brought work. My tent works, my propane stove works, that the car's four-wheel drive works. I want to know those things work, not in the suburbs, out in the wild where I need them. Does the leadership concept work in the wild? So to answer this question, I want to explore 4 cultural issues, challenges. And again, think about your context. What are the issues? What are the challenges? And see if you can't tie some connection between generative leadership and your cultural challenge. Because here's the deal. Any leadership role you're in, actually, by show of hands, if you're in a formal leadership role, it's got a title and a name, and people, yep, that's what you do, raise your hand. Okay? If you're in an informal leadership role, you don't have the title, you don't have the name, but you operate in a way that has some leadership to it, raise your hand. Nice, way to raise your hand. A lot of people are like, I don't know, I'm only a leader if I have the title. That's not true at all. This is great. And in those roles, formal or informal, here's a question, if you haven't asked, I'd encourage you to ask yourself, how do I create a healthy culture? How do I help make sure that the team, the group, where we're going, that it's healthy, that the culture is healthy. If you know who Jim Collins is, he's famous for saying, culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Culture is everything if you're a leader. If you do anything now or in the future, you're going to be asking yourself, how do I create a healthy culture? This is an important question we have to come back to time and time again. So here's where I want to go. I want to talk about these things I just described, what is a generative leader, and show you how this leadership concept directly ties into everyday culture challenges, things you're going to experience on your teams, things you're going to experience in your places of work. Okay, by show of hands again, how many of you have worked a job that you would describe as a less than ideal work environment? If your hand's not up, that means you've only worked in ideal or incredible work environments, which is possible. Less than ideal, keep them up. Okay, there we go. Yeah, it was less than ideal. Now, by show of hands, how many of you have had such a poor work experience that it significantly impacted your productivity and longevity in the job, i.e. you quit or you left? It was so bad. Okay, so it's, I don't know, maybe a third or half of the people that had their hands up. I would, from just that, would tell you probably it was a culture problem, a leadership issue that created a culture issue that made it just a horrible place to go. Who wants to go to that type of job day in and day out? And also, who wants to lead a place like that that has no vision or direction? You want to be thinking about, how do I create a healthy culture? This is the key to a thriving workplace, in my opinion. As leaders, we must, and I consider you all leaders, even though not everyone raised their hand, you have some sphere of influence. As leaders, we must understand how to create teams, departments, and organizations and places where people can thrive. Generative leadership, what we're talking about, provides this orientation and framework for implementing some of the most important soft skills and provides a template for addressing these organizational culture issues. Soft skills are everything. A lot of you, if you're like me, you're going to got your degree, you've had some experience, you're going to go try to get a job, and the person is going to ask you some questions about your competency, but you know what they're doing? I'm interviewing a person, we have a position open, and every time I'm interviewing them, they're thinking I'm interviewing them to see how good are they going to be at the job. But what am I really thinking? I'm thinking, do they fit here? Are they a good culture fit? I'm thinking, because competency is just the baseline. You got to be competent to do the job. I'm thinking about the culture fit. I'm thinking about their creativity, their innovation, their ability to be on a team, the ability to handle conflict, soft skills. Generative leadership is all about these soft skills. And I think it addresses culture problems. So here's the 4. These are just what I think. But right now, if you have in your mind a place that you spend a lot of time, I want you to try to think, like, right now in your mind, what's one major problem with that space, that group, those people, that business, that job? What's a major problem, a culture problem? We all have it, and you don't need to share it out loud or point to the person that you think is the problem. I'm just talking about the culture problem that exists. Here's mine. Low motivation, lack of engagement, lack of ownership, and an inability to multiply. To me, those are the 4 things that I think just drain a team. If someone has no motivation, no engagement, lack of ownership, can't multiply. If you have 2 out of those 4, you cannot be on my team. 1 out of 4, maybe we could work on one of those. We could work on the engagement, we could work on the ownership. If you have 3 out of 4, I don't know why you're even applying. The problem is most people don't come in with that. They start to develop that sickness over time, and it becomes difficult. So these are the 4 I think are issues. And if you've worked in an environment, those things kind of reproduce, they become really difficult. So here's why I think it's important to think, well, how do we solve that? How do we solve some of those problems? If I'm a leader, I need to think about, how do I solve these issues? I can't just say, oh, they're bad employees. Let's dismiss them and look for someone else. It's not good enough when you're the leader. So we're going to consider those 4 challenges, and then I'm going to try to provide you 4 pictures of what I think this looks like, 4 archetypes, 4 characterizations that I think negatively impact a place, a culture place, and then give you a challenge of why I think generative leadership can fix it. And then that's it. That's where we're going tonight. So first one, motivation. This is the person who is outwardly present. Okay, all of you are outwardly present here tonight, but inwardly absent. And some of you are inwardly absent, I'm sure of it, in a room this size. You're just like, I'm here, but inside, I'm somewhere else. Maybe up here, I'm somewhere else. I'm absent. This happens at work, but what's sad is when this is at work, you're missing a sense of purpose. This is the person who has no purpose. The picture in my mind, do you guys have residence halls or front desks here? People work at front desks somewhere around campus. A lot of campuses have like a desk worker at different places. I call this the bored front desk worker. The bored front desk worker is the classic person who's lost a sense of motivation in life. They're usually on their phone and they're sitting there, and if you have the overnight shift, it's the worst. And you're scrolling, and you actually maybe even do get depressed because your job is so pointless. You've lost all purpose. First job I had out of college, I worked at a hotel front desk. I put on a really nice suit every day. I go check people in, check people out, and I thought it was a pretty great job because I got to meet people like Joe Montana. And I got to meet people like Al Gore came to the hotel, and the CEO of Starbucks came through the hotel. It was a pretty fancy job. But doing the check-in and check-out every day, over time, I began to lose my sense of purpose. And plus, it was a pretty expensive hotel to go to. So get this, I had one person check out. They were there for 6 days and spent $75,000. Just another day in the life of the great-great-great-granddaughter of Henry Ford, Just $75,000 on a hotel stay. So my motivation is waning, and plus there's this opulence, and I didn't know how to, I couldn't find a sense of purpose in this job. Well, here's what's interesting. A year later, that completely changed. Daniel Pink says this in his book, Drive, The Surprising Truth About What Motivates Us. He says, if we've ever spent time with young children or remember ourselves as kids, we know that we're not destined to be passive or compliant. We're destined to be active and engaged. And we know that the richest experiences in our lives aren't when we're clamoring for validation, but when we're listening to our own voice, doing something that matters, doing it well, and doing it in the sense of service of a cause larger than ourselves. So in the end, when we understand motivation, it's good in the kind of an old school model, like you just got to do the job to get the paycheck. We don't really live in that world anymore. In the 21st century, it's essential for business and for leaders to understand motivation because it's an affirmation of our humanity. When we operate in a healthy motivation, it kind of affirms what we were created to do. So here's what changed for me. My supervisor came in and said, hey, we got a new plan. You can upsell people into rooms for as much as you want, up to the price of the next room. So for example, and this is like 15 years ago, so this is a little crazy, the lowest starting room was $400 a night. That's the I don't want to say the poor room, but that's what it was. The $400 room night was where we started. The next room up was called like the junior suite, $750 a night. And now they said, hey, front desk person, if they're coming in and they're paying $400 and you want to put them in the $750 room for $100, go for it. You want to put them in that room for $600, go for it. Or you can try to convince them to go into that room for $750. It's up to you. You get all the leeway, and whatever you want to do, as long as it's ethical, you can try to upsell them into that room. And by the way, every dollar that a guest spends over the course of the month extra than what was booked in the reservation, you get to take home 10%. Oh, well, that's interesting. This just made the boring job of checking in and checking out people kind of a game. And it became a total game. We would, at the front desk, we would try to look at who's coming into the hotel, try to figure out if we could upsell them, how much we could upsell them for. And that $75,000 guest, I upsold her into the presidential suite. And in one moment, I suggested, would you like the presidential suite for the next 6 days? And I was about to tell her the price, and she said, do it. And she spent, in that moment, an extra $16,000 on her stay. This is like a semester of school. It's unbelievable. And I just put her in for full price. I never said the price. It worked out in the end. And so I got this opportunity to create, to do things differently. That changed my motivation. I also got an opportunity to train other employees. So here's what happened. Core to generative leadership is this idea of development and innovation. Generative leaders find ways to equip and resource their followers to shift their motivation from the carrot stick. A lot of you guys are thinking carrot stick, carrot, do this, you get this. Stick, do this bad, you get the punishment. Unfortunately, that type of motivation structure, it doesn't work in the long term. This type of leadership motivation is effective. The reward, it's effective in the industrial age. It's not effective now. And like Makoto Fujimura says, to be human is to be creative. So we need to find motivations that work with creative people. What is innovation if it's not creativity applied to the workplace? As leaders and followers, we must innovate. We must find ways to change and help shift people's motivation. A generative leader is not focused on a particular outcome. That would be just like check them in, check them out. That's all we need as a hotel to run. A generative leader is looking on perpetual outcomes, things over time to achieve organizational goals or team goals, and allowing space for that innovation to happen. So the best part of those upsells, I could do whatever I wanted. I could use any trick in the book, and I felt like I could finally be creative in sort of a mundane job. So number one, if you want to address a lack of motivation and you have any type of leadership influence, number one, try to create systems that incentivize creativity or incentivize innovation. Number two, engagement. This is a problem, lack of engagement. And I know this, you know this, we know people that are like this. They're physically present, but outwardly, they're actually absent. They're inwardly absent and outwardly absent. They're there, but they're not really there, right? They're physically on the team, they're physically in the room, but you get zero engagement from this person. The archetype of this person is Zeke. Any Zekes in the room? Not talking about you, that's good. I'm talking about a former employee I worked with. My first day of work, I walk in, he's got a cubicle, no windows, and it's like 8:30, I walk in, and he's got his laptop and his desk up, and he's just reading a book in his office. Oh, slow day, okay. Come in the next day, there's Zeke, he's reading a book in his office. He's an hourly employee, and he's reading a book, and I thought, and I'm in charge of this team, I'm a new leader on this team, I'm thinking, okay, I wonder how I'm gonna address this lack of engagement. And he just stayed in his office all day. Didn't talk to anyone, didn't go anywhere. Not only do we hope our workplaces are filled with motivated employees, but we need people that are engaged. If you're a leader and you have someone on your team that's not engaged, you could just say, well, that person needs to move on. But as a leader, you always have this obligation to try to figure out how to shift that and change the culture. Engaged staff is a sign of organizational health. If you think, is this team going to be effective? You could ask yourself, how engaged are the people around the table? How engaged are the people I work with? A Gallup study found in 2022 that quiet quitters, we've heard about this, make up at least 50% of the workforce, maybe more. And here's what they said. Why is this the case? This overall decline was especially related to a lack of expectations and opportunities to grow, blah, blah, blah. But then this phrase, feeling cared about. Feeling cared about. Lacking a connection to the organization. This signals a growing disconnect between employees and their employers. They say that this quiet quitting trend is only going to get worse, and that the U.S. continues to take steps further back in this. And that right now, in 2022, this is from 22, the second quarter, we got the most disengaged, fully disengaged at 18%. 1 in 5 just like not doing anything at work for as long as they can until they're caught. But that only that the very top third are even possibly engaged. It's a huge disconnect. So here's the irony with Zeke. I accepted his lack of engagement. I accepted it and probably perpetuated it because guess what? I didn't say something like I should have right away. I sort of let it ride. And here's why. He was really good with data. He was the data guy on the team. So I just kind of thought, well, that's just what data people do. They run the reports and then, no offense to any data people in the room. I thought, oh, he's the data guy. He runs the report and he gets me what I need. I asked for this, it's done in 5 minutes. He would do everything when asked really well, and I now know it's because he just wanted to get back to his book. He wanted to get back to reading, is what I think it was. But I let that lack of engagement perpetuate, unfortunately. This is where leadership is so important, and we can talk about leadership, for hours and hours and days and do programs, but the importance of leadership in shaping culture is so important because it sends a signal to everyone else in the work environment about what's okay. And I'm telling you, this was such a big fail for me. You cannot call yourself a leader and not call out behavior that is unhealthy for the culture. So if I have one person not doing something, I think that's fine, it's just one person. It sends a signal to everyone else in the room that it's okay. And that was a huge miss. And the answer to this problem of the lack of engagement was sitting before me the whole time. I walked by the break room one day. Zeke, who had just had a baby, was laughing and telling stories about his newborn in the break room with all of his colleagues. And I remember thinking, I have missed it for a year. I didn't know he was married. I didn't know he had a baby. I didn't know anything about him except he ran reports for me really fast. And I missed it. Remember, generative leaders view each key relationship in their orbit as one that they must be intentional with. There's no wasted relationships. People are not units of productivity, they're units of personality. People must be engaged holistically, and in doing so, we can increase positive outcomes. Generative leadership engages relationships for the sake of the relationship. It's sincere and it's authentic. It's not just to get them to be better employees. It's because you genuinely want to know the people around you. This was really annoying for me when I was working on my dissertation when Liz and I were suffering a number of years ago. I did a case study, so I had to interview people, and I had to interview generative leaders. And it was really great to interview these senior leaders from across Christian higher ed colleges, presidents, vice presidents, provosts, but they kept asking me about me. And I'd want to get to the interview. They wanted to know about what I was studying and how many kids I had and where I was living. And I realized later on, well, that makes sense. They're really good at intentional relationships, not to get something for them, because that's just who they are. If you want to address a lack of engagement, build an intentional relationship with the people around you. Number 3, and there's only 4, so we're getting there. Outwardly present. This is a lack of ownership. Outwardly present, inwardly present. You're showing up, you're doing the thing, you've got motivation, you've got engagement, but you have no ownership. You lack action. This person lacks action. The archetype for this is a little abstract, but hang with me for this example here. This is the group or the herd mentality or common space. And here's what I mean by this. Sometimes the group is collectively lazy because there's just kind of uncertainty about what we should do. I had an employee pull me aside the other day. I'm her supervisor. She's over a team of people, and she's like, they didn't do anything. I told the group, we need you to do this. It's for an admissions event, and they just sat around. They didn't do anything. And she was kind of venting to me, and I'm like, oh, it sounds like there's a lack of ownership. She's like, yes, that's what it is lack of ownership. No one felt like they owned the event. They all kind of thought it was just the event leader. This happens in common space. Those of you who live in the residence halls or lounges, or you see this in a neighborhood park, you'll see this in common space in buildings. And students, you know this especially. What happens when it's everyone's space? It becomes no one's space. It's a public space, so it's no individual person's space. It degenerates into piles of dishes in the community lounge or in the kitchen. And it becomes a space that no one takes care of because no one owns it, right? And you see this all the time. And if you go, next time you go through a public space, look around and think, if this was my living room, would it look this way? Probably not, because it's your living room. You would clean it, you'd care for it, you would take care of it. Ownership is what keeps my my grass cut, my desk cleaned the way I like it. It's mine. I'm in charge of it. So at the individual level, how do we address this when there's a lack of ownership? This is the person who's like, then if it's not on the job description, I don't have a category for it. It was me in my naive grad school days thinking that I just needed to do the job description to perform well. I have motivation, I have engagement, but I didn't see any sense of ownership in the job. So in my opinion, ownership is a result of you got motivation plus engagement, and you need to multiply it with responsibility. Responsibility helps people have a sense of ownership. It may be hard to describe, but you guys all know people right now in this room that have a high sense of ownership. They're responsible and they own the things that they're in charge of. And maybe they even perpetuate that sense of ownership. Maybe it even inspires you to have more ownership in your life. Generative leaders help address this culture of lackluster ownership. And here's why: because it sees the uncertainty of the group or the uncertainty of common space as the uncertainty that we talked about earlier as an opportunity. Instead of just being like, well, I don't know where we're going to go or what we're going to do, they see it as an opportunity to adapt. So when problems arise, the generative leader leans into learning. When problems arise, the generative leader implements new solutions. A culture of ownership is the result of many variables, but most certainly it's a sense of empowerment to solve problems and move forward through uncertainty. They don't freeze. They adapt, and they find creative solutions, and in that is a sense of ownership. These are some of my favorite people to work with because I feel like I'm trying to keep up with them, and they push me to become better. They have a great deal of ownership over what they've been given and entrusted. Last one, multiplication. Like I said, you can be a great leader, you can be a phenomenal leader in whatever your area of life, but if you don't understand how to help create a culture that multiplies, it's going to end when you walk off the stage. They're a cog in the machine, and they're fine with it. The culture is fine with it. What we're looking for, what we hope for in leadership, is a culture that reproduces healthy things. The archetype for this, the example for this, I kind of went a different direction. I went something that's positive instead of just negative. This is what Ken Blanchard calls the raving fans. Customer service is so good, you create raving fans. What are stores that come to mind that have created raving fans? Chick-fil-A, it's on the list. Dutch Bros, Nordstrom's. These are, and the list goes on. Some people get really into Costco. They're like raving fans of Kirkland gear. Here's what's also interesting. I think the most contemporary example of a raving fan, people that create raving fans, is a social media influencer. So I did a little homework research this week. Did you guys know that the top 20 social media influencers, such as Cristiano Ronaldo, who has over 750 million followers, one person, Kylie Jenner and The Rock, you gotta love The Rock. You know what they get paid for one post? One post from a sponsored ad. $1 million at the minimum. Cristiano Ronaldo averages $3 to $5 million per post. Why would a company pay that kind of money? Why would a company pay a social media influencer that kind of money? It's because of this. It's because of the multiplication factor. If you're a Swiftie, you're into what Taylor Swift is into. You act like her. You want to do the things that she does. The lack of multiplication is detrimental to culture because it's one of these few areas that if you're not multiplying, if you're not growing, I think there's no neutral ground. Healthy things grow. Good trees produce fruit. And if you're not growing, I would say you're dying. You're going backwards. And this actually works in our personal life too. If we're not a growing, healthy person, we might be atrophying more than we realize. This begs the question then, if you're a leader, that every, I believe, successful leader should ask is, how do I create a healthy culture that multiplies and reproduces? Well, generative leadership gives us a framework for this. It's part of the generative leadership that's rooted in the development-oriented part that brings this about. Back to Erickson's human development stage, counselor, psychologist in the room. This is the nurturing sort of part of generativity. You create programs for mentorship, provide resources for professional development, support young leaders in developing management skills. In a very real sense, this leadership minor I've learned about today, and some of the structure around it, is meant to perpetuate and resource young leaders to grow, to take the skills in the classroom and to learn how to apply them out in the real world. It's more than just making time for growth, though. It's encouraging and celebrating the recipients to do the same. So every time, this is really basic, but every time I create an agenda for my team, I have something on there called like a resource share or something that's like, I think going to be helpful for them in their job. I try to force myself to put one of those things on every agenda. And then I tell them, I want you to come up with your own or use this on the agenda you have with your team. Why? Because I don't want to end with the people that are using the resource. I want the idea that we can share resources to be a multiplying experience that people have over and over again. I saw this 2 weeks ago. Our university president, did something really interesting. He was a baseball guy in college, and he was a baseball player for a Hall of Fame baseball coach. This baseball coach coached a number of famous people in the big leagues, and he was now 70 and retired as a coach. And the president said, hey, I want to have this Hall of Famer come to campus for the day, spend some time with our new baseball coach, who's 27, young head coach. Our new athletic director is in his early 40s, and I got to tag along for the day because I get to work with these people. And we're out to dinner, and we're listening to the sage advice and wisdom of this Hall of Fame baseball coach, and he's telling some of the most amazing stories. And the head coach on our team and our athletic director are like soaking it in and learning from this guy. And I remember thinking, our president that made this all happen, he played baseball with him for like a year and a half. It wasn't this long 10-year relationship. But what he did in that moment was he created space to develop and grow his team. Here's a misconception we have in leadership all the time. I have to do it. I have to develop you. I have to be the one that's wise enough or smart enough or old enough to develop you. That's not true. The person who's the leader is the person who sets the agenda for that to happen, can create the context for that. It doesn't have to be you. So he used his relationship with this Hall of Fame coach to bring him in to benefit some of the young employees in our organization. It's a perfect example of how you use your position and resources for growth and development without it having to be just you. This is generativity. This is generative leadership. So to address a lack of multiplication, if you want people to multiply, you need to think about how you can develop and grow them. And I promise you those baseball practices after that visit are going to be different for the rest of the year because of that experience of developing and growing. So to summarize and close, some of the most favorite words audiences ever will hear. And I've been there myself. This is why generative leadership is so appealing to me. It works and it's lasting. It works because of the 4 components I told you about, the theoretical, intentionally relational, innovative growth. It works and there's research to show it works. But it provides a convincing game plan, outline, approach to create a thriving organizational culture. And if you can create a thriving organizational culture, I think you can accomplish anything. If you have a team that's bought in and is going to stick around, you can accomplish anything. Generative leadership works. I've outlined those various parts. It lasts, and it's the sign of great leadership. It's not that what you can accomplish. Again, dictators can accomplish a lot. That's not great leadership. It's what lasts beyond you. It's the value of what goes after you for the team, the organization, or the next leader. So students, staff, guests that are here, when you spend your leadership capacity on relationships, innovation, development, and adapting, the result is a far greater impact than you might realize. In fact, the results are generative. Our workplaces, our teams, our families, our communities are desperate for leadership that can shape and lead a healthy culture, even a thriving culture. We must make this the highest priority of our leadership. Thank you. Thank you.